we want Christians to be the pioneers of excellence in storytelling and kind of fill this void that Hollywood is starting to create and say we can be quality storytellers who tell compelling fiction that stands on its own.
What if the stories we need most come wrapped in dragons, quests, and kingdoms that never were? Wilson Hickman is a screenwriter and creator of The Lost Healer, an award-winning Christian fantasy series that invites viewers to see God through story. We'll explore the craft of screenwriting, why fantasy holds unique power to reveal truth, and how story becomes a mirror for faith without shortcuts or formulas. Thanks for joining us. Wilson, welcome to Seek, Go, Create.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Glad you're here too. So, Wilson, you are, if I read it correctly, you are a storyteller, correct? Is that what you tell people you do?
Yes.
And do they follow it up like, come on, man, what do you mean by storyteller? What does that mean?
That's actually a very interesting question. A storyteller, I think, really points back to the reality that we as humans are made in God's image. He's the ultimate artist, the ultimate storyteller, if you will, because he ultimately is working out his grand plan through all of human history in ways that we can't necessarily perceive. But he gives us glimpses of it in scripture at key pivotal moments that he reveals to us. And I really think that a good story that's well told is going to have echoes of the gospel in it, because that's ultimately the narrative around which all of human existence centers. And so you have, your typical story beats of the protagonist starts out in a quote unquote normal world where everything is fine. Then something called the inciting incident happens that takes them out of that normal world. And now they have to solve some kind of problem or go on some kind of journey to grow and change and overcome some obstacles. And then in the course of that, there's usually a part towards the end of the story where everything seems lost. It's kind of the death of the hero moment. Even if they don't literally die, there's some sort of hopeless moment that gets introduced. And then they find a way to come back and learn the lesson, overcome the adversity, and then we reset to the normal world, except for now the hero has grown and changed. And the way I just described that, it's very obvious that echoes the narrative of Scripture. We start in the Garden of Eden, everything's good. The inciting incident is the fall of man. Man is now separated from God in sin, and the grand narrative of Scripture is God rescuing man from his fallen condition. There's the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. And so every good story is going to ultimately point back to the story that God is telling through all of human history.
And the cool thing about it, I don't think I want to go down this path right now because I want to ask a little background to get prepped so that we could get into kind of how this project you've got going now came to be. But the fascinating thing to me from the biblical narrative is there is this big, huge story. And then there's micro stories all throughout it that are just full
Absolutely.
of character and rich. And I think at times, this is me just sort of observating something. I think at times that is awesome to people, but then I think at times it confuses people because there's certain stories embedded within. But I want to hold that. Let's put a pin in that. We may come back to that in just a little while because I think it leads to some inspiration that might come down the path. But I want to back up. I know you're not an incredibly old and mature young man, but I want to ask, first of all, have you always been a storyteller? I mean, were you like, 4, 5, 6, and telling stories either verbally or in writing?
Oh, definitely. My love of storytelling, in particular writing, goes back as far as I can remember. As soon as I knew how to write, I would literally write stories with a pencil in my hand because I hadn't learned how to type on a computer yet. And I would write entire chapter books that way. It was exhausting. My hand got a lot of cramp. Chapter books, which soon grew into what you would consider novels, 200 plus pages. And then I got to a natural transition, I think, was to writing scripts because I've always loved film as well. And some of my favorite books have been made into films. So, for instance, I grew up on the Chronicles of Narnia books by C.S. Lewis, and I also was a kid when those came out in theaters as movies, and that was a very formative experience in my childhood. And so I've always kind of felt that as I was loving writing all throughout my teen years, I would naturally transition to writing films as well, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, the neat thing about that, and I do want to say I've looked at your proof of concept of The Lost Healer, and I watched that, and you do have what I'll call a visual eye, and we'll talk more about some of this later. And the reason it's kind of cool to me is that my son, he's probably a couple years older than you. I think he's like 31. How old are you?
I just turned 28. So
Okay. So I remember when he was younger, we could tell that he had more of a visual artist storyteller to him. And I am not that way, or at least I didn't think I was. Anyway, I've actually started writing some fiction and all recently. But
oh, nice.
um, he could tell a story and then he also could visualize it. And Wilson, it seems as if you've got those things going too, and not everyone can do that. When did you realize you had that ability or talent or skill that not just in words on paper, but visual?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It would probably be in my mid-teens, like maybe 14 or 15. My sister and I'm best friends with my sister, by the way, so it's no coincidence The Lost Healer is about a brother and a sister, because that unique bond of siblings often finds its way into my stories. But around age 15 or 16, my sister and I started making like home movies on our phones, and that we would write the scripts and then film them with ourselves as the characters. And that was really, I think, a turning point for me in terms of recognizing that I love not only storytelling on the page, but also storytelling on the screen. And, you grow and learn with those experiences. Our early movies I look back on now and I'm like, oh, we could have shot them so much better and with different angles and more intentionality with the cinematography. But your gifts, when you start to use them, are going to be untried and unrefined, if you will. But the more you do something, like anything else, you keep using the gift to get stronger. And by the time I was getting ready for college, I realized that I really wanted to serve God in the capacity of pursuing visual storytelling. And so I went to film school, and that's where I got a lot of hands-on experience making short films. And that really triggered my visual storytelling instinct. And I came out and continued writing films, continued making short films whenever I could, and that's led to this proof of concept for The Lost Healer. I can't really point to one specific instance where I was like, this is where I meant to make films. It was definitely a gradual process, but looking back feels inevitable. I can definitely see how God was sowing the seeds for it, if you will, all through my childhood and even when I was just writing books.
I love too, this is a fascinating thing that you said you grabbed your phones or something. I think it's really cool how some of the tools to do these things are so readily available.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
and this is what I'm thinking. I don't know if you're much of a historian as far as movies go, but I remember seeing the movie, gosh, I want to say Spielberg. No, J.J. Adams did it. It was the Super 8. And it was kind of like this homage to the 70s and these guys that would get like these old video Super 8 type cameras, which took some effort. And also, you didn't get the instant ability to see what you recorded. I remember my son really loving that movie because it fed the thing that we're sitting here talking about, something that he really had a desire to do. I think a beautiful thing, probably a divine thing, that you were able to kind of see real quickly and probably get some good feedbacks like, hey, that looks pretty good. And I've just got this thing in my pocket. Or have you put any thought into that as to how accessible it was for you to practice that craft early on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing blessing. And it is a bit of a double-edged sword though, because on the one hand it makes it very easy to practice your craft. On the other hand, sometimes it's too easy. You start to take it for granted and you don't necessarily press yourself to, grow and try as hard as you possibly could to nail something, because the tools, the ability to get quote unquote good enough is right there. So trying to push yourself to be excellent is something that takes discipline. And it also takes a love of your craft, because there's also a double-edged sword to loving a craft. And I absolutely love the craft of storytelling. But the double-edged sword to that is you're always your own biggest critic. I definitely will look back on past things I've made and be like, oh, there's so much I would do differently now. But to your point about accessibility, it's definitely been a huge blessing to have that tool so readily available. You were also mentioning physical film. You didn't see it when you recorded it. You had to splice it together in this process called linear editing. In my teen years, I used a program called iMovie, which is a nonlinear editor, and it's a resource that is readily available. And you're able to just cut things together and do things in a few minutes that would have been a lot more work back in the days of physical film. you just stop and marvel and like, this is the era that God chose to have me be created in. And you realize that it's an immense privilege. It really is. And it just makes me think of, I don't want to take this for granted, and I don't want to take the gift of storytelling for granted either. I want to use these tools that I've been blessed with to the best of my ability and then do the best stories that I can.
So sometimes people that have those skills, I don't want to say they have a perfectionist bent to them, but I've noticed some people, is that you create, but they hesitate to share it with others. And I think sometimes it's not totally perfectionism, but that feeds into it. I'm going to throw a little bit more gas on that fire, and then I'm going to let you respond to it. And then I think that's even magnified when people have this thought that they're doing it for the Lord, that it is some divine calling or whatever you want to word in there. So having said all of that, respond, because you now are putting something out into the world. Talk through any of those items that you had to deal with. We love the journey here. That's what we love
Yeah.
talking about here at Seek, Go, Create. So talk a little bit about that journey of creating. How good does it need to be? When do I share it? If I do, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So the trap of perfectionism, I'll start there because I've been perfectionist my whole life. Sometimes to absurd degrees. Like when I was really little, I would think the world ended if I couldn't finish a story or something. And it's just writer's block. You'll get over it in a few weeks. But because I was so wrapped up in that, it felt a lot bigger than it was. That's something that God has challenged me to learn and grow in, is to not find my identity in the craft that I'm gifted in. I can enjoy that craft and I can take pleasure in serving God through it, but I can't stake my emotional well-being. I can't stake the value of who I am and my purpose in life. Can't be wrapped up in the art of filmmaking or storytelling, because there will be fluctuations in productivity. There will be days where I am not in the zone. And on those days, if my identity is tied to the filmmaking, then my identity is going to dip along with my productivity. And so you need to find your identity in God. He's unchanging. And so that's the first way I've found to kind of escape the trap of perfectionism. Perfectionism can also make you afraid to share your work because you're eternally criticizing it and you're never done with it. It's never good enough. But if you recognize that it's a continuous learning process and you want to make it, yes, the best you can, but within reasonable limits, it helps to set deadlines. Deadlines are a perfectionist's best friend / worst enemy. They're the worst enemy because they put a lot of pressure on you, or you put it on yourself rather. But then they're also your friend because if you didn't have a deadline, you would never finish anything. I was really grateful for a lot of these film festivals that we've been entering the proof of concept in, because I'm very happy with how the proof of concept came out. But the festival deadlines kind of require you to, okay, have it finished, have the color and sound done, and then submit it, and then it's off to the races. And no matter how many minuscule details you might look back on and go like, well, if I'd had more time, I might have tweaked that one little thing. And that's another reason why test screenings are very important. We did test screenings for this to get feedback on the clarity of the story. And it helps to have an outsider's eye on it, because especially as a filmmaker, you can be so wrapped up in the script that you know it forwards and backwards. And it's like, wait, is it clear to someone who knows nothing about the project? And so that's very helpful. When you've let go of the project to the extent that it's not your identity, I think you feel more comfortable sharing it with people and getting their honest feedback. Because then it's like, oh, they can criticize the project, but they're not criticizing me as a person. They're criticizing the work, and we have the same end goal, which is to make the project the best it can be. So that's definitely the mindset you have.
Right. Do you recall the first time you shared some of your work with someone maybe that didn't have the same last name as you, outside the family? Someone's like,
Sure.
I don't know about you, but sometimes family can be extremely critical. But do you remember that? Do you remember a feeling or anything that you had when someone said, man, this is actually either really good or not good, the feedback that you got?
Yeah, so the first time I shared a film with someone who was not my part of my family was in film school. I had made a film in my first semester, a short film. We all had an assignment to make a short film for this editing class, I think it was, or a production class. We screened them all as the class finale. And seeing it up on the big screen next to everybody else's work, the first thing I thought was, what did the projector do to my color correction? I later found out this was notorious at the school, and a lot of students complained about the projector ruining the color of their projects. But, as a novice color grader at the time, I really didn't know what I was doing when it came to color correction. And so I got it so it looked good on my monitor, not realizing that, oh, the projector is different. If you push too much color into the shadows or into the highlights or anything like that, it's going to show up as this monochromatic tint over the whole footage if it's in a different projector. Well, that's exactly what happened. To my untrained eye, everyone else's project looked good because I hadn't been staring at it for weeks on end like they had. But then the minute I saw my project, which I had been staring at for weeks on end, and I knew what it was supposed to look like on my monitor, and it had this big green tint, I was just like, wow, I can't even pay attention to the actors or the dialogue now because all I see is the terrible color. But fortunately, I found out afterwards that was a common issue with that projector. I wasn't the only one who thought it had messed with their project, but mine stood out to me because of how much I'd been looking at it beforehand. There was a future class where I had that projector again, and I had gotten my film looking what I thought was really good, and then the projector ruined it again. And so there's a student showcase at the end of the semester where you submit your favorite project and they screen it for the whole school at the end. And I deliberately did not submit my project. And literally, I had a professor reach out to me and be like, hey, how come you didn't submit your project? It was good. And I'm like, because the projector's going to ruin the color in front of the whole school, and I don't want that. But despite all that, like the professor I just mentioned, I had a lot of people give me positive feedback. And so there's also some, in a kind of odd way, there's kind of a benefit to being your own biggest critic. Because on the one hand, you're constantly pushing yourself to get better, sometimes to an unhealthy degree. But on the other hand, most people are not as invested in your project as you are, which means they're not going to criticize it as thoroughly as you are. So there's that aspect as well.
Yeah. Did you go to film school? Is it a Christian film school or was it secular? I was about to say Gentile or something like that. Was it just what type film school did you go to?
I'll say it was a Christian-influenced film school. I don't know that there's truly such a thing as a Christian film school and that, like, they only study Christian films and they only teach from a Christian worldview, because a sad reality of history is that most memorable films, most films that have stood the test of time and become cultural icons, were not made by Christians. And therefore, by extension, don't have a Christian worldview, at least as its overarching thing. And now it's not to say there aren't secular films that I like to make. Films that are not preachy, but that honor God's word through weaving biblical themes organically into a character-driven narrative. But the school that I went to was certainly not a school that was like, oh, we're only going to watch Christian films or even necessarily teach from a Christian worldview. And that was another good experience because a lot of my fellow students were not believers, and I actually was able to make films that wove the gospel in a non-preachy manner. In fact, I actually had a good friend who became a Christian towards the end of our run through college together. And he told me that one of my films was actually a part of what got him thinking about the gospel, and he ended up getting saved. So that was an amazing blessing.
Wow. So you almost brought this up, but I'm going to go ahead and go there. Many people will also say, in general, that Christian entertainment is not quite the quality of, let's say, we'll call it secular. Obviously, you are in what we would call the faith or Christian. Talk a little bit about when you started moving into this arena, your observations and perceptions about the quality of work. We're not going to throw people under the bus. That's not what we're doing here. But in general, at times, I can be a little bit cynical about this topic.
That's totally fair, and you're certainly not alone. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get into Christian film in the first place, because there are noteworthy exceptions, certainly, but by and large, the stereotypical view of Christian films has been that they're basically sermons disguised as art. They don't really have substance and story. They're just an excuse to preach at the audience. When we sit down to watch a movie, we don't want to be lectured. We don't want to be told what to think. And that goes for any message. It's not just the gospel. When I was younger, I used to actually think, like, is there something just intrinsically non-cinematic about the gospel? Like, Christian themes, the moment you put them in a film, suddenly the film becomes bad, but any other message can be preached and it's fine? No. We're seeing that in modern Hollywood, where modern Hollywood is now becoming the evangelists of an anti-biblical agenda. and their films are just as ham-fisted, just as preachy as the stereotypical Christian film. They're just preaching a different message. It's just as bad because it's a sermon, not a story. It doesn't invest us in a world, make us care about characters, and make us feel rather than think. It just wags its finger and says, here's what you're supposed to believe, and here's what you're not supposed to believe, and that's not a movie. That's not a story. So, yeah, but getting into the faith-based film space, I definitely was pleasantly surprised to find that I'm in good company with a lot of up-and-coming artists who I think we're seeing a shift in that paradigm of we want Christians to be the pioneers of excellence in storytelling and kind of fill this void that Hollywood is starting to create and say we can be quality storytellers who tell compelling fiction that stands on its own. It doesn't have to be wrapped in sermon illustrations in order to appeal to its audience. And like you've seen the Lost Healer, much like the Chronicles of Narnia or the Lord of the Rings, is meant to be a broadly enjoyable story, just with the broad appeal of fantasy. But fantasy has this unique ability to explore themes of good and evil to a depth and magnification that most genres don't. Because it's fantasy and removed from the real world, you can weave a lot of typological allegory into it without seeming preachy or forced. And if the story's told well, it makes the audience feel rather than think. And hopefully, at least at a subconscious level, they're thinking of things like the beauty of goodness and the place of humanity and why is humanity drawn to the struggle of good versus evil? What does that ultimately point to? And that nudges them gently through art rather than lecturing them and making them immediately shut the message down with their intellectual side of their brain.
Yeah, the way I word it is that people let their guards down and they're not trying to block things. And I think it's Kiva, your main character, has a very, I'll use this word, attractiveness, attracting, and I don't mean attractiveness, not just the looks, but there's an attraction that she has that pulls people in that I think will pull people in to want to know more without really knowing it. I think that's the power of not having someone stand up behind a pulpit and preach or, scripture and things like that. Not that there's anything wrong with scripture that, people, please keep your rocks in your pocketbooks. Don't throw things at me now.
What's
But
the other benefit? Yeah, they're instead you have the advantage of being able to have types and shadows, much like in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, they weren't going around preaching the modern gospel of Jesus dying on the cross because it hadn't happened yet. They didn't have that context. So what you have instead is compelling narratives about real people that have real twists and turns. And we can look back on it through a New Testament lens with hindsight and see, oh, this person's life kind of foreshadows Jesus in this way. And that's the kind of stories I want to tell. Stories that you can see types and shadows of Christ woven throughout them, but they're not explicitly preaching.
right, yeah. And so one other thing just on general, I guess, filmmaking and art is some will say that one of the reasons for the quality difference is the budgets, the financial resources, and things like that. I'm not sure that I buy into that, but I'm sure you've heard people say that. And it may have crossed your mind at times too. So speak to that. The people that will say the reason that some Christian entertainment is not the same quality is because of the difference in money.
There is some truth to that. Production value definitely helps, especially if you don't have the budget for good sound. Like, if you don't have good sound, you can't make a good movie. I'm sorry. Your acting can be great, your script can be great, your cinematography can even be great. But if the movie does not have good sound, it's not a good movie. No one's going to put up. I have a phobia for bad sound. It's one of the things I fought the hardest in film school. But that aside, you can definitely make a high quality production without a lot of money. It's the most important thing. The first and most important thing is a good script. You need to have a good story as your foundation. Because if you don't have a good story, then it doesn't matter how good your actors are, it doesn't matter how good anything else is. If that story does not hook the audience and give them something to care about very quickly, then there's no point in the rest of it. And so that's your foundation, is the strength of the script. And then once you have that, you of course need to attach good actors. You need to be conscious of directors' techniques. I think it really helps to take acting classes yourself if you want to direct, which I've done, because you want to understand the actor's mindset and how you can speak to them through their process. And that really helps with bringing the characters to life and kind of merging your vision with the vision of the actor. And if you're blessed with really talented actors, like I was blessed to work with on this, you mentioned Kiva, Allison, who plays Kiva, she did so many things on the set that were not necessarily in the script that just enhanced the character. There's a line she ad-libbed in the middle of a take, and I liked it so much I actually put it in the episode. And just these little emotional subtextual things that she would do that I hadn't written that were just naturally came out. And same with Evan, who plays her brother, the prince. It was all so incredible. So good acting is definitely important. But in terms of scale, because we're specifically talking fantasy, we got very creative to bring a fantasy world to life on a small budget. I don't know if you've seen the behind the scenes video on our YouTube, but we actually transformed a modern basement into a castle library. And we did it just by taking foam boards you can buy at Home Depot, painting them gray, and taking a drill and carving them to look like stone, and then putting them up against the walls and carving a fake window into one of them, and we just pumped a film light through it to be the sun, and then you fill the room with haze and light candles, and it's quite convincing on film. And so, yeah, we did that very inexpensively, and no one would ever guess that if you pan the camera just a little bit to the right, there's a modern couch over in the corner. One of the cinematographers that I followed for a while has a saying that I really like, and it's, you don't have to have a high budget set. You just have to make whatever is inside your camera frame look high value. It doesn't matter what's off to the side. The camera's never going to see that. So that's a very important line.
I actually think that it forces a higher level of creativity when you don't have just a pot of money. I mean,
Exactly.
some of the most creative things I've done in business and at other times, I mean, one of the toughest financial periods in my life, I actually wrote a novel during that time frame. And
Nice.
I'm not sure exactly why. I think it was divine, but it was kind of like, huh. Because I would never call myself, actually, I am a storyteller, but for years I wouldn't call myself that. And so that's kind of one of the reasons I was drawn to have this conversation with you. Let's take a quick pause. I want to ask you something. When was the last time you really questioned what success means? In my novel, Coach, A Story of Success Redefined, you'll meet Cooper Travis, a man who had it all but still felt empty. His story mirrors what so many leaders quietly face, the pressure to chase more while silently wondering, is this it? This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. It's about transformation, faith, and learning how to break free from the addiction to achievement. If you're ready to redefine success on your terms, then Coach is the book for you. Visit timwinders.com/books or grab your copy wherever books are sold. Let the story do its work. All right, let's get back to the conversation. You've mentioned Narnia, you mentioned Lord of the Rings, and when we start talking about this genre, that comes up quite a bit as far as inspiration. Were you a Tolkien or a Lewis just kind of geek nerding out growing up, read everything, did everything and that's okay now. It used to not be good to call somebody a geek or a nerd. Now it's like a popular thing to do. But was that you? Were there other influences that you had other than those? Tell me a little bit about your influences that led up to the story we're about to talk about.
Yeah, so I actually have several diverse influences. I did mention Chronicles of Narnia. I read those books growing up. I saw the films in theaters. That was my biggest influence. I did not get into Tolkien until later in life. I only recently saw the Lord of the Rings films like a few years ago. And then I'm reading the books currently. I'm actually reading The Hobbit right now. But I didn't read it as a child, which I think would, Tolkien has Christian influences. Lewis was straight up writing a Christian allegory. But nonetheless, they're universally appreciated stories that have a wide audience outside of the church. And I just find that so inspiring and it just goes to show the potency of the fantasy genre for exploring good versus evil and even rich theological themes in a non-preachy manner that can make a wide audience appreciate it just through the quality of the storytelling. So yeah, those were definitely big influences. I will say that some of my biggest influences from a film standpoint have actually been Pixar films from the 2000s, Wall-E in particular. One thing you may have noticed if you go watch the proof of concept episode on thelostdealer.com is a lot of scenes with no dialogue. The story's happening visually, but there's no talking. And I drew a lot of inspiration from the film Wall-E. It's my favorite Pixar film. I love when you can tell a story with minimal dialogue. Because again, it forces the screenwriter to be more creative and make the viewer more visually engaged, because rather than having characters spoon feed exposition through dialogue every other, when the audience has to work to figure certain things out, then it makes them more engaged and it kind of pulls them into the story more. And now, of course, there's a fine line with that. You don't want to keep too much hidden and confuse them. But on the other hand, you don't want to spoon feed them everything, because then they feel like, oh, the character's just lecturing me. They wouldn't really say that. They're just info dumping on me. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy from the 2000s. That was one of my childhood favorites growing up. And I even appreciate the films more as an adult now than I did as a kid. I see deeper, even Christian themes in them. And the quality of the storytelling, where they really focus, and just there is quite a bit of crazy, elaborate fantasy world. The fantasy world is certainly there. It's largely revealed through the subtext and the dialogue, but the emphasis is on the characters and their journeys.
And so that leads into the beginnings of this story that you're telling with the Lost Healer. I've noticed with myself, and I think other storytellers do this too, they somewhat start with a setting. I don't watch them. In fact, it's oddly enough, I don't watch TVs and I barely watch movies. Your proof of concept is probably the most I've watched in so much. I'm a reader and things like that. I don't have a TV or screen or anything. And I think I would love to watch it on a bigger screen because I watch it on a smaller screen. But I'm actually working on some fiction right now, and I began with the setting. It's a biblical setting of the time between the crucifixion and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So 30 to 70, with some biblical nuance. And then I'm building characters from there. I think I've heard you say, though, that you begin with character. Is that correct? Talk to me more about that. I hope there's not a right or wrong because, whatever. But tell me how you got the beginnings of this concept. And then obviously you're nodding the character.
Yeah, no, there is no right way to do it. In fact, I would think that in your case, historical fiction, the right way is to start with the setting, because if you're trying to base it off of history, then you want to know the setting and the limitations therein. So that's certainly the right approach in that case. A lot of fiction writers who are writing just pure fiction without any historical relevance or attachment to that, they will often start with setting as well. And even in fantasy, I would think you'd probably start with setting a lot, world building, fleshing things out. For me, though, I always start with a character, usually. Because, now that doesn't mean I don't have some vague idea of the setting. Like, I knew it was going to be fantasy, so immediately I'm thinking, forest, castle, those types of things. But rather than trying to flesh out the setting too much, I actually focus on the character, because the character is who's going to come alive in my head and tell the story for me. If you get a character that is so compelling in your mind that they take on a life of their own, they're going to write the story for you. You can have some general idea of where you want it to go, certain plot beats you want to hit, certain lessons you want to be learned along the way. But very often, if the character has truly taken on a life of their own, you can have a plot point set up in your mind, and then when you get there, you realize, wait a minute, the character wouldn't do this thing. Well, now I got to change the story, because I'm not going to make the character behave out of character. That's the mentality I take on, because when I get excited about a character, I'm like, oh, I have a character who has this flaw and has this desire. Now, what's the most interesting obstacle I can throw at them? And that's how the plot and the setting gets developed a lot of times for me.
Do you develop backstory? Do you develop the complexity? Are you already thinking of the conflict? It's so difficult for me to watch things with my wife. We've been married for 37 years. She doesn't like conflict. It's really hard to weave a story without conflict. The novel I wrote, she really dislikes it because I didn't wrap things up just nice and tidy like she wanted it to be at the very end. But, at what point in developing, I believe I heard you say you started with Kiva and you've been layering from there. At what point did you begin in your concept introducing other characters, bringing them in? When did you put it in, I guess, the setting? Because that's fascinating to me to learn that. I mean, obviously, if you had fantasy in mind, that gives you a lot of leeway because it could be future, it could be past, it could be space, it could be the woods, the green woods that you chose. Where did that weave in for you?
Yeah, I was always kind of imagining the woods, because I grew up in Arizona, in southern Arizona, where there are no woods. It's all desert. And so moving to Kentucky a few years ago, I said, okay, I'm gonna stop writing films that take place in the desert. What's something that can take place in the forest? And I immediately think fantasy. So, I that's kind of where how I settled on the genre of fantasies. And then actually coming here and seeing all the greenery and seeing that we actually have 4 seasons, I was just awed by the beauty of God's creation I've been missing out on all these years. And so I'm like, I want to film this. I want to have this on the screen. And I started with the characters of Rian and Kiva. So Kiva and her brother Rian. And like I mentioned, I'm best friends with my sister, so I wanted to explore the unique bond between siblings in a fantasy context. But I started thinking I also am very passionate about the fear of, growing up and the responsibilities that come with that and charting an uncertain course for the future, struggles that I've experienced as a Christian, such as how do you share the gospel with a friend or a family member? I thought to myself, well, my sister and I are both believers, but what if one of us wasn't? How difficult would that be? Or maybe one of us is a believer, but they're struggling in their faith and they're living inconsistently with what they profess. Like, how would the other one address that? Us being best friends, but also there's that awkwardness of how do you reach your family member with something that they may not want to hear? So that kind of grew the conflict of the story, because you're right. It's very hard I don't think you can tell a story without conflict. Is the situation where Kiva wants to fulfill their father's legacy, finish his work of finding this lost relic called the healer that will bring peace to their kingdom. But her brother has been manipulated by this high king who invaded their kingdom and is now imposing his ideology. And in order to maintain the peace, her brother Rian wants to go along with the High King, even though the High King is essentially making him a puppet king. He doesn't really have power. But Rian, with good intentions, I'll mind you, wants to. He would rather bow and go along with that than start this uprising that would actually lead to his people being freed. So it's a. But Kiva sees that this High King has malicious intentions. He's oppressing their people, and there's even hints throughout the proof of concept that he may actually have dastardly plans for Rian's life as well. And so Kiva is wanting to share all that with Rian, especially when she finds this amulet that is a magical compass that points to the healer's location. So this is tangible proof that what they're looking for actually exists. And she wants to show that to him. But because Rian is under so much political manipulation and pressure and is constantly being pulled away, it's the struggle of, well, it's never the right time. He's never going to understand. And so she ends up feeling like she's on the search alone. And then what grew from that is the recognition that, well, sometimes in life, the person we want to reach the most, the person who's closest to us, it's very hard to reach them. But that doesn't mean that we stop living for Christ and being a good witness for him. Because while we're really trying to reach the family member or the friend, you never know who else you're influencing, that you don't even know that they're even watching you. And that's where I got the idea for the character of the enemy knight. Aaron, his name is. So there's, in the proof of concept, without spoiling too much, there's a young enemy knight who's patrolling the woods that Kiva is searching for the healer in, defying the Empire and bravely living out her faith, and it intrigues him. And by the end of as the story progresses, he begins to slowly question if he's on the right side. And meanwhile, Kiva has no idea that she's even having this impact on it. She's just focused on trying to reach her brother. And so that's kind of a message of, hey, live for Christ, because even if you don't reach the person that you are struggling to reach, you don't know who else you're impacting. I've been blessed to see that in life. People I didn't even know that I was impacting have come to me afterwards and said, like, hey, your film really inspired me, or just the way you live out your faith inspired me, and now I'm a Christian. Like my friend from college earlier that I mentioned was an example of that. And so that's kind of the where those 3 core characters came from. And I've always loved a story where the heroes have, incredible odds stacked against them, and where they're all coming into roles that they don't feel prepared for, but nonetheless are demanded of them. So Kiva feels like she's alone on this quest and has to finish her father's work, as no one, not even her brother, will help her. Prince Rian feels like he needs to submit to the High King and undertake this role that he doesn't even want to do, but it's the only way to keep peace. It's the only way to save his sister, the only family he has left. And so he feels like he's a powerless king. He's a figurehead. He's a reminder of what his people have lost. He's a conquered king. And he wears that with shame, but he feels like it's the only path before him. He has no choice, and he'll take that burden if it means keeping peace. And then Aaron, the enemy knight, is slowly coming to realize that he's on the wrong side of this war. Well, now what do you do with that information? Do you turn against your oppressive masters who will kill you if you turn against them? And it's all about the overarching struggle of good versus evil, and how even in our situations in real life that are not as, larger than life and expansive as they are in fantasy, nonetheless our actions have eternal implications. And as we watch these characters struggle through their challenges, my hope is that people will even subconsciously begin to think about the real world struggle between good and evil, and how they have to participate in that. They have to choose a side in that.
Yeah, the cool thing, let me see, there's a couple things I want to bring up here. How much do you have written currently? Or maybe another way of asking it, how much of a story do you have? Because when you start stepping into this genre, there's this massive world building. And I'm going to pause there and let you answer that because it leads to my next question I want to ask. But how much is there currently, either in your head or on paper?
Sure, yeah. No, I've written an entire series Bible. I've got a ton of outlines and notes on my computer. The difficulty, especially with fantasy, is you can write tons of world building that never even makes it into the story. I know that over here in this corner of the world, this political situation is happening, and I know that like 1,000 years ago this thing happened. Will that ever get mentioned in the dialogue? Maybe, maybe not. I've tried to focus primarily on the character arcs. What's the most interesting challenge I can throw at Aaron? What's the most interesting challenge I can throw at Kiva? And as those challenges push them in new directions, then I start seeing, okay, if this challenge takes them over here, I can explore this corner of the world. Now let me flesh that corner of the world out more. I let the characters and their journeys take the lead in that regard. I've known of a lot of writers who they'll go on for a long time writing lore and backstories and, political details of the world, but then they never actually get around to writing the story. So I, again, prefer to let the characters lead with that. And a lot of times my world building decisions will come as I'm fleshing out the character arcs. So I might be outlining a season and saying, okay, in this season, I want this character to get from A to B. And along the way, here's their struggle. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the best way to materialize that struggle? Well, maybe it's interference from another kingdom. Okay, what is this other kingdom? And then you start to say, okay, maybe that has ties to this other kingdom I've already established. Maybe there's some interesting backstory there. But again, I try to keep it centered on the character so I don't get bogged down in details that don't actually affect the story, if that makes sense.
So, with that, I'm going to ask you to maybe give a glimpse of what one might see after they check out the proof of concept, where there was some character development, which I think is important. And we saw a little bit of the conflict and probably got some glimpses of future conflict and where things are going. But in Christian fantasy, we often have things introduced such as talking animals, dragons, things flying, supernatural, whatever, not necessarily space travel, maybe
Sure.
time travel. To me, what, by the way, I got to say, time travel, I hope you're not going to do time travel. To me, it's one of the cheapest storytelling mechanisms that's out there because it's like, hey, everything, the Marvel, everything is gone off the rails. Let's just introduce time travel. What might we see in the future with additional stories as they're brought into this?
Okay, well, you're definitely not going to see talking animals, I can tell you that. Because, and not just for budgetary reasons, but also because the target demographic of this series, I don't feel lends itself as well to talking animals. But it's funny. When we were shooting this, and the villain makes his appearance, General Graham shows up. Our hair and makeup artist said, "Oh, he should ride in on a dragon." And I'm like, "We don't have the budget for that, but maybe in a future season." And I stand by that. Maybe in a future season you will see a dragon. I've actually written a series of fantasy books that I haven't yet published, and I wrote those before The Lost Healer. And they're not the same story, but I sprinkle in Easter eggs in the dialogue of The Lost Healer that reference that other fantasy series that I've written. And it's like, they're supposed to take place in the same world, but they're not the same characters. Dragons, at least a dragon, may be involved in a future season. But that's why, and that goes back to what I said about writing and getting creative with financial resources, is this first season, as we've written it, it is strategically written to focus mainly on the characters being chased in the Arkwoods. So there's not going to be, crazy CG sets or large armies in the first season. It's strictly designed to get you invested in the main characters. And then, Lord willing, we get the first season made, and we can grow from there and expand with scale season by season. And then, you might see the dragon.
Yeah, because again, when you say Christian fantasy, it kind of opens up the doors for just a ton
Yeah,
of stuff. Fascinating. There's so many ways to get this type of visual storytelling out to the world now. There's obviously feature length films, there's streaming, there's smaller screens, there's series. What is it? What would be your ideal? I don't know if that's the direction you're headed, but because obviously things can obviously adjust and change over time, but how would you really love to see this released to the world over time?
over time it was definitely conceived as a series, as an episodic, so that's definitely the format I dreamed of it in. That being said, the as I've been talking to other filmmakers and getting advice from other producers, I'm considering the possibility of a feature film, depending on which one is easier to raise funds for. But again, that's just a theoretical possibility at the moment. I'm currently relooking over some of the scripts for season one and seeing if it could be adapted into a feature film if that became a necessity. But the overall story is ideally conceived as a series, but it's flexible to go either way, and that's one of the benefits of being a filmmaker is you spend so much time with the story, so much time developing the characters that you know it inside and out. So if someone were to come to me and say, "Hey, we like it, but can we make it a film instead?" I'd be like, yeah, we can take the characters and just, reshuffle a few plot points, but I know their arcs, I know their journeys. I'm not going to have to start from scratch, so to speak. So there's that advantage.
How much does the financial aspect of projects like this weigh on you and weigh on? We know we're not supposed to be anxious for anything, but we talked earlier about the resources to get things done. And then, depending on how things are funded, and I know a little bit about this as a business guy and investment guy, there is the need for return on investment and for things like that. Is that something that you think about it a little bit, a lot, more than you should? Where would you categorize your thought process of the financial component of this storytelling project that's in front of you?
Oh, it's definitely something you have to think of. And much as me and every filmmaker, I think, wishes that we could just think about the creative aspect of it, you also have to think about the business side of it. Because that's how you attract investors. That's how you prove that you're worth investing in. And so there's certainly that element to it. Um, the healthy balance, I think, is staying true to the core of your story. Like there are certain things that can be shuffled around that could maybe lessen the budget here and there without sacrificing the quality of the characters' journeys. And that's the most important thing: is are the characters doing the most interesting things I can make them do, and are they bringing us along on a compelling journey? Even if the twists and turns of that journey aren't the thing I first visualized when I sat down to write the script 3 years ago, if it's still compelling and I feel that it still takes the characters on a memorable journey that audiences can be invested in and that I myself am invested in. That's the kind of the philosophy I have. So yes, business considerations are very important, and you do want to be business savvy. You want to network with producers. You want to tax incentives, all that type of thing. But don't get overwhelmed by that. Don't get so laser focused on the business that you start making it, a cardboard cutout of films that have already been made. Because then, even if you do get it made, it's just a product at that point. It's not truly the art that you poured your heart and soul into at the beginning. And when a project truly has art and truly has soul behind it, it shows. Those are the films that resonate and that stay with people beyond their initial release. And those are the films that become, the rewatchable icons of cinema. And that's what I think people should be aspiring to make, not just does it tick all the business boxes? That's important, but it needs to be a story from the soul that is uniquely a story that you tell, because your unique voice and your unique passion is going to come through if you do that correctly.
Yeah, Wilson, I know that the what I've been able to see obviously is your proof of concept. I've actually got it pulled up right here on my computer screen. And that's something that people can go see. And before we finish up here, we'll make sure they've got all the links and all for that and put it down in the notes. But what can you tell us about the stage that you're at? I believe you've won awards and some things like that. So share what you've done. I think you've done some of the film festival circuit and things. So where are you at the stage of the project that you can share with us? And then I've got a few more questions before we wrap up on that.
Sure. So yeah, our proof of concept episode was independently produced with the goal of just raising awareness for the series, building an audience for it. And we've been doing that through social media marketing and its film festival circuit, which, as you mentioned, it's been blessedly doing very well. It's received 7 award nominations, and it did win Best TV Series at International Christian Film Festival a few months ago, which was such a blessing. I mean, I'm so grateful to God for that. There's a whole story there, actually. I didn't even think we'd get into that film festival because we submitted during the standard deadline, whereas conventional wisdom says you're supposed to submit in the early deadline so that they don't watch a bunch of films before they get to yours and already have their slate filled. So I was surprised that we even got in, much less that we got 3 award nominations and that we won one of them. So that's been an incredible blessing. Yeah, and the stage that we're in currently is as I'm preparing and continuing to network with filmmakers, talk with potential executive producers. We're about to enter the realm where we either find a producer or we start fundraising for the film, one or the other. And that's where we're making decisions like, is it going to be a feature? Is it going to be both? And just so that's where we're in right now in terms of just building our audience and raising awareness so that, Lord willing, if it does come to a crowdfunding, there's actually, a crowd of people who are already interested. And we've been growing that and just anxious to see where the Lord takes it. And I'm very, very grateful for the continued film festival run. That's actually still got a few to go. So I'm looking forward to hearing from that. Our next notification date's going to be, it may have already happened by the time this episode gets released, but I've got another notification date coming up. And so that's been a continued blessing as well, because every time you have a chance to go to one of these festivals, there's networking opportunities and you meet more people and your audience grows. And so that's been the stage that we're in currently.
Right. How would you define your audience? What is I don't want to say ideal audience or anything like that, but who's the audience that this is really, really going to appeal to? You probably have started to see some of that materialize.
Yes. So the target demographic for the series is like ages 15 to 25, teens and young adults. And it's a fantasy certainly has a broad appeal, so we've certainly seen it attract viewers that are outside that demographic. But I would say that's been the majority of our viewers have been between ages 15, 25, and even up to 34. I've seen, based on our social media data, has been the most consistent impact that this has had. And I will say that it has appealed to Christians and non-Christians alike. We've seen that as well. So I've been very grateful for that because that was the intention.
Yeah. I actually enjoy things that have a Christian component, but they appeal outside of that. I agree. I mean, the proof of concept, nothing that I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think it would attract, I think it would draw people in, which is probably the desire, is what you're looking for. Tell people what to do now. I mean, I've got the losthealer.com pulled up here. We'll include links, but just go ahead. This is kind of like pitch time for you. Tell them what to do, and then I've got 1 or 2 more things before we wrap up here.
A big thing that helps us is if you sign up for the email newsletter, because that's where you're going to get exclusive access to behind the scenes content, series updates, and a lot more content that we've got coming out. The email newsletter on thelosthealer.com. And you can also follow our socials. Encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and it's at the Lost Healer Series.
Excellent. We are seek, go, create here, those 3 words. And I think projects like this really epitomize all 3 of those for a lot of reasons. But if I were to ask you to choose one of those words over the other 2 and why, which one would you choose? Seek, go, or create?
Yeah, that's challenging because it really is all 3. I'd zero in on create if I had to, because we're creating stories and characters that hopefully will resonate with people for years to come. A large part of doing that, you really can't create without seeking and going, because you're seeking God's guidance, you're seeking to glorify Him, and then you actually have to go and do it. And so I think it really encompasses all 3. But it starts with create for sure, because if you don't have a story that you've created and that you're proud of, then there's really nothing to go with.
Yeah, that's good. And at some point, you went out in the woods and filmed and worked on this project. Anyway, excellent work. Wilson Hickman, thank you for joining us here at Seek, Go, Create. I am applauding you. I'm pulling for you. I'm going to encourage those that are listening in to go to thelosthealer.com and you could watch I think it's 15 minutes and there's some other things I could watch too, but it will draw you in. It'll probably leave you wanting more, which is probably the goal. And that's a good thing. So go check that out and we'll be pulling for you. We'll be watching with expectation to see good things going on from Wilson Hickman and the Lost Healer. Thanks for joining us here at Seek, Go, Create, everyone. We've got new episodes on YouTube, on all the platforms, every Monday. So we will see you next time here at Seek, Go, Create. Hey, before you go, I want to leave you with a challenge. If you're enjoying the conversations here on Seek, Go, Create, I think you'll love the deeper journey my novel Coach, A Story of Success Redefined, takes you on. It's a story that's moved many of my readers to rethink what success actually means and how to live a life aligned with faith, purpose, and peace. Pick up your copy today wherever you buy books or at timwinders.com and begin the journey for yourself. Thanks again for listening. And as always, keep seeking, keep going, and keep creating.